Maren Calloway was 68 years old and sitting on a splintered bench at Hatteras Harbour on an April afternoon when she watched the last thing her family had ever owned motor out of the slip and turn south toward the jetty. The Maeve Sea, 36 feet of fiberglass and diesel, and 4 generations of hands that had gripped her wheel, hauled her nets, cursed her engine, and loved her. The way working people love the instruments of their work. Not with sentiment, but with the specific tenderness of maintenance, of showing up every morning before dawn to check her oil and her bilge and her bait wells. Because the boat did not care whether you were tired or grieving or 68 years old with a left shoulder that had started aching in the afternoons. The boat cared only that you came. The charter captain from Virginia Beach had promised to keep the name. Maren had watched him say, it watched his mouth form the words and had believed him the way you believe a stranger who is trying to be kind about something he does not understand. He would keep the name for a season, maybe 2. Then he would rename her something jaunty and forgettable, something with the word real or hook in it. Because that is what charter captains did, and because the name Maeve Sea meant nothing to a man who had not known Maeve Calloway. Née Sullivan, who had been born on Ocracoke Island in 1932 and had died in the kitchen of the Hatteras cottage in 1998, with a green ledger open on the table and her last entry still wet. The stern shrank across the harbor. The wake flattened. The diesel sound thinned until it was just another texture in the wind. Then the boat rounded the jetty, and the jetty swallowed it, and there was nothing left to look at except the empty slip. The water inside it dark and oil-sheened and rocking gently against the pilings, as though it had not noticed that anything was missing. Maren's right hand was on her knee. Her left hand held the strap of a canvas sea bag that sat beside her on the bench. The bag had been her husband's. Inside it, a brass ship's clock that Maren Calloway had mounted on the Maeve Sea's bulkhead in 1978 and wound every Sunday morning for 23 years, until the morning his heart decided it was finished. A salt-stained ball cap so shaped to Cormac's skull that it held the ghost of his head even when no head was in it. A folding knife with a bone handle that 3 Calloway men had used to cut bait and splice line and open envelopes and do the 1,000 small violences that a knife does in a working life. Tide tables going back 15 years rubber-banded. The pages curled and stiff with salt, each one annotated in Cormac's handwriting. A handwriting so compressed and angular that it looked like the script of a man who had been taught that paper cost money and words cost time. And you should spend both carefully. The clock still kept time. She could hear it ticking faintly through the canvas, a sound so familiar that she had stopped hearing it months ago, the way you stop hearing the ocean when you live beside it. But now, sitting on the bench with the empty slip in front of her, she heard it again. Each tick a small metallic syllable. Each syllable a unit of time that had once belonged to Cormac and now belonged to no one. Her hands were trembling, not from cold. The April air was mild southwesterly, carrying the green mud smell of the marsh flats behind the harbor. Her hands were trembling because this was the first time in 47 years that Hatteras Harbor did not hold a boat with the name Calloway on its registration. Padraig's skiffs, Eamon's trawler, Cormac's Maeve Sea gone. The slip was just water now, and water did not remember who had parked on it. She had $120,000 in a bank account in Manteo. She would not touch it. She had $10 in the right front pocket of her jeans, folded once earned that morning, mending nets at the fish house behind her. The $10 was hers. The $120,000 was not. The $120,000 was 4 generations of Calloway mortgage payments. Property taxes, slip fees, fuel bills, insurance premiums. The whole grinding arithmetic of a fishing family compressed into a wire transfer from a closing attorney's office in Nag's Head. That money belonged to a family. Maren was the only member of that family still sitting on this bench, but that did not make the money hers. It made her its keeper. and she would hold it until she understood what the family would have wanted her to do with it. She did not cry. She had learned from Cormac that crying was not the opposite of working. Crying was just a thing that happened on the way to the next job. The problem was she did not yet know what the next job was. Every fisherman on Hatteras Island had a story about how their people came to the Outer Banks. The stories were all the same story, wearing different clothes. Somebody's grandfather or great-grandfather had arrived on the island. Sometime in the first quarter of the 20th century, had looked at the ocean, had looked at the sound, had understood that a man could make a living pulling things out of the water between them, and had never left. The details varied. The trajectory did not. You came, you fished, you stayed. You taught your son taught his son. The ocean did not change. The family did not leave. The Calloway story was no different. Padre Calloway had arrived on the Outer Banks in the early 1920s with nothing except the knowledge of how to read water and the belief that a man who could read water would never starve. He had been right about the first part. The second part had required some flexibility. Padre had built boats by hand, small wooden boats, clinker-built, the kind of boats that leaked in a specific way that the builder understood, and strangers did not, so that bailing became not a failure of construction, but a private language between the man and his vessel. He had fished for bluefish and king mackerel and Spanish mackerel and red drum and flounder and cobia. He had sold his catch at the Hatteras fish house for whatever the fish house was paying, which was never enough and always something. He had built a small shingled cottage on the sound side of Hatteras Island, married a woman from Manteo, raised a son named Eamon, and died in 1968 at the age of 71. In the cottage in his chair, looking out the window at the sound, Eamon had continued. Eamon had maintained his father's boats, had replaced them with a 36-foot fiberglass trawler he named the Maeve Sea. After his wife had mounted a brass ship's clock on the bulkhead of the wheelhouse in 1978, because Eamon believed that a boat without a clock was a boat without a heartbeat, and had wound that clock every Sunday morning for 23 years with the same 3 turns of the key, always 3, because Eamon had opinions about overwinding that he expressed by simply never doing it. Eamon had fished the same waters his father had fished. He had sold to the same fish house. He had raised a son named Cormac in the same shingled cottage, and he had taught Cormac everything Padre had taught him, which was everything there was to know about pulling a living from the Atlantic Ocean off a 30-mile barrier island, and nothing at all about anything else. Cormac had been born in 1956 in the cottage. He had been on his father's boat at 4 years old. 2 young people on the island had said, and Eamon had not listened, because Padre had put Eamon on a boat at 4, and the Calloways did not believe the ocean became safer if you waited to learn it. Cormac had grown up with diesel under his fingernails and salt in his hair, and the particular posture of a boy who has spent more time on a pitching deck than on flat ground. A posture that was not quite a slouch and not quite a lean, but something in between, a body that had learned to expect the floor to move and had never fully trusted stillness. Cormac had taken over the Maeve Sea from Eamon in the late 1970s. He had fished her for more than 40 years. He had maintained her engine with the same hands that Eamon had maintained his father's boat's hands, that knew the feel of a gasket that was about to fail. The way a musician's hands know a string that is about to break, by the texture, by the give, by a knowledge that lived in the fingertips and not in the brain. He had been the 3rd generation of Calloways to fish commercially out of Hatteras Harbor. And he had done it without complaint and without romance, because the fishing life on Hatteras was not romantic. It was early mornings and diesel fumes and the ache of hauling nets and the boredom of a slow afternoon trolling for king mackerel in a flat calm when the fish were not biting, and the radio was playing the same country station it had played since 1994. Maren had not been born into any of this. She had grown up in a small inland town in North Carolina, the daughter of a carpenter named Bill and a nurse named Ruth. Nobody in her family knew the smell of salt water. Nobody owned a boat. Nobody woke up at 4 in the morning unless they were sick. She had come to Hatteras the summer she turned 21, following a help-wanted ad tacked to a bulletin board at a gas station in Greenville for a waitress position at a seafood restaurant in Buxton. She had needed a job. Hatteras had needed a waitress. The match had the utilitarian romance of a bolt finding its nut. She had met Maren Calloway on a Friday night in June, the one night of the week he did not go out on the water. He was 23, tall, lean-browned by sun in the particular way of a person who has been outdoors since birth. Not tanned but stained, the color deep in the skin permanent, the kind of brown that did not fade in winter. Because winter on Hatteras was just a colder version of outdoors. He sat at the bar eating fried shrimp and drinking a Budweiser and watching the Braves game on the television above the register. And he did not look at Maren when she refilled his water glass. He did not look at her the second time either. The third time she set the water down hard enough to make the ice jump, and he looked. Their courtship had been conducted almost entirely on the water. This was not because Cormac was incapable of taking a woman to dinner or a movie. It was because Cormac was incapable of being anywhere other than the water for more than 12 consecutive hours without becoming a diminished version of himself. Quieter. Stiffer, his eyes losing the specific alertness they had when he could see the horizon. So their second date had been a sunrise on the Maeve Sea Maren, sitting on the engine cover drinking coffee from a thermos, while Cormac checked his nets, and their third date had been an afternoon run across Pamlico Sound, in a light southwest breeze during which Cormac had let Maren take the wheel. She had nearly hit a channel marker. The bow had swung wide, the marker's red paint flashing close enough to touch, and she had frozen hands, locked breath, stopped. Cormac had not raised his voice. He had not grabbed the wheel. He had placed his hand over hers on the wheel and corrected the course with a single smooth motion. The way you correct a child's pencil grip. Firman hurried the pressure, saying everything his mouth did not. And then he had removed his hand and stepped back and said nothing. She understood in that moment that he was testing her. Not testing whether she could steer a boat. Testing whether she was the kind of person who could tolerate the silence of the sea. She could. They married when Maren was 22. She moved into the shingled cottage on the sound side of Hatteras the cottage Padraig had built. Eamon had repaired. Cormac had lived in since birth. The cottage smelled of diesel and salt, and the particular mustiness of a house that has never been fully dry because it sits on a barrier island where the humidity does not drop below 70% from April to October. The kitchen had a gas stove that Eamon had installed in 1971, and a table that Padraig had built from salvaged ship's oak, and a window above the sink that looked out over the sound and in the mornings. If Maren stood at that window while the coffee brewed, she could see the light come up over the mainland in a way that she had never seen light come up before. Not the abrupt dawn of an inland town where the sun clears the tree line and the day begins, but a slow horizontal spreading the sky turning from black to gray to a pale gold that seemed to rise out of the water itself, as though the sound were generating its own light. She learned the water from Cormac. She learned it the way she had learned everything in her life, not by instinct but by attention. She did not have the Calloway birthright of knowing the ocean from infancy. She had something else. She had the capacity to watch, to memorize, to practice in private, and to perform in public only when she was certain she would not embarrass herself or the man who was teaching her. She learned to coil a dock line the flat spiral way, because Cormac had opinions about the alternative that he expressed through silent correction rather than conversation. She learned to read a tide chart to predict within 20 minutes the time of the turn at Oregon Inlet on any given day. She learned to identify a weather change coming across Pamlico Sound by the color of the sky above the mainland, a specific yellow-gray that meant a squall line was building over the coastal plain and would reach the island in about 90 minutes. She learned the names of fish by their weight in her hands. She learned the sound of an engine running clean and the sound of an engine about to become expensive. She learned that on Hatteras, a conversation between a husband and wife could be conducted entirely in the language of work. Pass me the wrench check, the starboard cleat, the ice is low, and that this language was not a substitute for intimacy, but a form of it. The way two people who have built something together do not need to discuss the building, because the building is the discussion. By the time she was 30, she could run the Maeve Sea alone in the protected waters of the Sound. She would not take her into the open Atlantic without Cormac, not because she was afraid, but because the Atlantic was not a solo act, and she respected the distinction. Maren Calloway. Cormac's mother, the woman the boat was named for, had been born on Ocracoke Island 20 miles south. She had married Eamon in 1954, moved to Hatteras, and spent the next 44 years as the financial spine of the Callaway fishing operation. She had not been a fisherman. She had been something more important. She had been the person who made the fishing possible by managing everything on shore. The books, the ice, the bait supply, the fuel contracts, the fish house negotiations, the insurance, the taxes, the mortgage, the whole invisible infrastructure of solvency that kept a fishing family from going under between the good seasons. Maeve had kept the family's accounts in a small green ledger at the kitchen table every evening after supper. The system was precise. Date in the left column, species in the second, pounds in the third, price per pound in the fourth, total in the fifth, running balance in the sixth. She had known to the penny what every pound of bluefish and every pound of king mackerel had sold for at the Hatteras Fish House across 4 decades. She had known which months were lean and which were flush, and which were the months you set aside the money that would carry you through the lean ones. The deeper lesson was not arithmetic. The deeper lesson was this: a fishing family survived not by catching the most fish, but by knowing precisely what the fish they caught were worth. Maeve had taught Maren to keep the ledger when Maren was about 25. Maren had sat beside Maeve at the kitchen table on the evenings when Cormac was still out on the water, practicing the entries, learning the columns, absorbing the discipline of a woman who had managed a family's finances for 4 decades without a calculator, or a spreadsheet, or a college degree. Maren had kept her own ledger from that point forward. A new green notebook, same binding, same column system, different handwriting. She kept it for 30 years, through lean seasons and flush ones, through engine overhauls and insurance increases, and the slow grinding decades-long decline in commercial fishing on the Outer Banks. The ledger was her inheritance from Maeve, more valuable than money, because money told you what you had, and the ledger told you what it meant. Maeve had died of a stroke at home in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in January 1998. Eamon found her when he came in from the harbor. The green ledger was open on the table. The last entry in Maeve's careful hand was dated that morning. 12 pounds of flounder at $4.80 a pound. Total $57.60. Running balance $14,211.47. The ink was dry, but the page was still warm from the sunlight through the kitchen window. Cormac had kept the green ledger on the kitchen shelf for the rest of his life. He had not written in it. He had simply kept it there the way a man keeps something on a shelf that he is not ready to close. But Maren had opened her own ledger the week after Maeve died, and she had continued what Maeve had started, because someone had to, and because the numbers did not care who wrote them down, as long as someone did. Lena was born when Maren was 23. She was 45 now. From childhood, Lena had been the indoor daughter: books, crossword puzzles, homework finished early. An allergy to bait that may or may not have been medical, but was certainly convenient. She did not like the smell of diesel. She did not like the sound of the VHF radio crackling at 4 in the morning. She did not like the particular dampness of a house that never fully dried. Lena was Maren before Hatteras, the inland girl, sharp, practical, more comfortable with numbers on a page than with numbers in a bait well. She had left the island at 18, scholarship to East Carolina University in Greenville, business administration, graduated with honors, hired by a commercial real estate firm in Raleigh. She came back for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and 2 weeks in August, during which she complained about the mosquitoes, the humidity, the internet speed, and the fact that Cormac still did not own a dishwasher. Tess was born when Maren was 28. She was 40 now. Tess was the sea daughter. She had been on the Maeve Sea at 4 years old because Cormac did not listen when people said, too young, because Eamon had been on a boat at 4, and Padraig had been on a boat at 4, and the Calloways did not negotiate with the ocean about when to start. Tess had coiled a dock line wrong once at 6 a figure 8 instead of a flat spiral, and Cormac had silently uncoiled it and recoiled it the correct way without looking at her. The correction delivered entirely through his hands, not a word spoken, not a glance exchanged. The whole transaction conducted in the Calloway dialect of work, which held that a lesson taught in silence was a lesson that stayed. She had never done a figure 8 again. She could read a tide chart by 8. She could identify a squall by the sky color at 10. Cormac had let her take the helm of the Maeve Sea for the first time when she was 12, on a calm September afternoon in the Sound. He had stood at the stern-arms crossed, ball cap low, and Maren had stood beside him and seen on his face the specific pride of a father who had just confirmed that his daughter's hands were the right hands for this work. Tess had worked on the Maeve Sea with Cormac from 18, fourth generation Hatteras Harbour. She had learned the full trade engines: electronics, ice fuel, fish sales, slip fees, insurance, Coastguard inspections, the whole grinding daily economics of keeping a 36-foot trawler operational in a century when the fish were fewer and the regulations were thicker and the fuel was more expensive every season. But at 35, Tess had left. A divorce that she did not explain in detail, a phone call from Beaufort that began with, "I need to go away for a while," and had stretched into 5 years. She worked as a marine mechanic at a repair yard. She and Maren spoke by phone once a month, short calls, polite, the kind of conversation between a mother and daughter who loved each other, but had misplaced the language for it somewhere between Hatteras and Beaufort, and could not find it in the static of a cell connection. Every year on the anniversary of Maeve's death, Cormac drove to the small cemetery behind the Methodist church in Buxton, where Maeve was buried beside Eamon. He brought Maren. They stood at the headstone for about 5 minutes, Cormac with his cap off, hands folded, Maren beside him saying nothing because Cormac was saying nothing, and the silence was the point. Then Cormac put his cap back on, and they walked to the truck and drove to the harbour and went fishing. It was the only ritual Cormac kept. It was also the only time Maren ever saw her husband completely still, not the working stillness of a man waiting for a fish to bite, but the true stillness of a man standing in front of something he could not fix and not pretending he could. Cormac died on a Tuesday in November. He was 70. Maren found him at 4:15 in the morning when she came downstairs to start the coffee. He was in the old recliner in the living room, the television still tuned to the Weather Channel, the overnight forecast for Cape Hatteras still scrolling across the bottom of the screen. His coffee mug from the night before sat on the armrest cold. His right hand rested on his thigh, and Maren looked at that hand. The hand that had gripped the wheel hauled. The nets corrected her course on a September afternoon 47 years ago by placing itself over her hand and turning. And she knew before she touched him that he was gone because his hand was lying in a way that a living hand does not lie, with the fingers slightly curled and the palm slightly up, as though he had been holding something and had let it go. He had died of a heart attack in his sleep. The medical examiner would say it had probably been quick. Maren would tell people later that he looked like a man who had simply decided not to wake up. She did not add what she actually thought, which was that Cormac had never decided anything simply in his life, and that even his dying had probably involved some private calculation about the weather and the tide, and whether there was enough fuel in the Maeve Sea for tomorrow's run. The funeral filled the Methodist church in Buxton. The entire fishing community of Hatteras Island came. Men Maren had known for decades, men who had fished beside Cormac for 30 years, men whose fathers had fished beside Eamon, men whose grandfathers had known Padraig stood in the small church in their khakis and their white shirts and their salt-stained ball caps held at their sides. They did not say much. Fishing men on Hatteras did not say much at funerals. They came. and the coming was the thing. Tess drove up from Beaufort. She stood beside Maren at the graveside, close enough to touch, but not touching. Her face was the face of a woman holding something behind her teeth. After the service, she found Maren in the kitchen of the cottage, and the thing came out not as a shout but as something worse, a flat, controlled sentence that landed like a stone on tile. You lived in the same house as him, and you didn't see he was dying. Maren had no answer. Not because the accusation was unfair, but because it was true. She had been so accustomed to Cormac's presence, the sound of his boots on the porch, the smell of diesel on his shirt, the weight of him in the bed at night, that she had not noticed the weight decreasing. She had not noticed the boots getting slower. She had not noticed that the man who had never missed a 4:30 morning had started sleeping until 5, then 5:30, then 6. She had missed it the way you miss a tide going out when you stand on the same beach every day. The water just gets farther away so gradually that the sand under your feet feels dry for a long time before you look up and realize the ocean has left. Tess stayed for 2 days. Then she drove back to Beaufort. She did not say goodbye. She called Maren once 3 weeks later, a call that lasted 4 minutes and covered the weather in Beaufort and the weather on Hatteras and nothing else. Then the call stopped. Lena arrived from Raleigh with a rental car and a leather folder, and the brisk efficiency of a woman who had closed 87 commercial real estate transactions in the past 5 years, and understood that grief like escrow had a timeline. She stayed 4 days. She handled the death certificate, the insurance claim, the bank accounts, the title to the cottage, the title to the Maeve Sea. She was thorough. She was organized. She was exactly the kind of businesswoman that Maren Calloway would have been proud of, and Cormac Calloway would have been baffled by. On the 4th day, Lena sat Maren down at the kitchen table. The same table where Cormac had eaten his oatmeal every morning at 4:20 for 30 years. The same table where Maeve had kept the green ledger. The same table where Padraig had eaten his supper every evening for 47 years. Lena opened the leather folder and spoke in the measured cadence of a woman who had learned to deliver difficult news without raising her blood pressure. The property taxes on the cottage had not been paid in 2 years. The homeowner's insurance had lapsed 18 months before Cormac's death. The mortgage, which Maren had not known existed, had a remaining balance of $114,000. Maren heard the number and felt something shift in her chest. Not pain, but a realignment, the sensation of a fact rearranging the architecture of everything she thought she knew. Cormac had taken out a mortgage 3 years ago to pay for an engine overhaul on the Maeve Sea. He had not told her. He had signed the papers, made the payments from a separate account she did not know about, and carried the debt the way he carried everything alone, silently believing that carrying it alone was a form of protection. He had been wrong, but he was dead, and she could not tell him he was wrong. And that was the cruelest part, not the debt, but the discovery that her husband had kept a secret from her, and that the secret was not an affair or a betrayal, but something almost worse, a kindness so misguided that it had become a trap. The Maeve Sea also needed to be sold. The boat's insurance had lapsed along with the house insurance, and the engine needed a $22,000 overhaul that neither of them could afford. Lena had already spoken with a real estate agent in Nag's Head. The cottage soundside of Hatteras' small dock quarter-acre lot would sell for approximately $380,000 in the current market. After the mortgage payoff, the back taxes and the closing costs, approximately $240,000, would remain, split evenly, $120,000 each. Maren listened without speaking. She understood the math. She also understood, sitting at the table with Cormac's coffee mug still in the dish rack beside the sink, that Lena was not asking permission. Lena was informing her of an outcome. The cottage would be sold. The boat would be sold. 4 generations of Calloways on Hatteras would end with a wire transfer and a handshake with a real estate agent from Nag's Head. Maren's voice came out smaller than she expected. Not weak, but compressed, the voice of a woman fitting a large question through a narrow opening. "Where am I going to live, Lena?" Lena did not hesitate. "Come to Raleigh. Stay with me until you figure something out. Maren looked at the window above the sink. The light was coming up over the sound in that slow horizontal spreading she had watched for 47 years. Raleigh was a city. Raleigh was traffic and strip malls and an apartment where the windows looked out on other apartments. Raleigh was a place where you could not see the horizon from the kitchen. And Maren Calloway, who had not been born on this island, but had chosen it, who had spent nearly 5 decades learning its water and its weather and its silence, understood in her body, if not yet in her words, that Raleigh was not a place that was going to hold her. She did not say this to Lena. She said nothing. Lena took the silence as assent, which it was not. Lena did not call Tess before deciding to sell. Tess learned from a fisherman at Hatteras Harbor, a man named Ray, who had been Cormac's friend for 30 years, who mentioned it at a fuel dock in Beaufort. The way you mention weather casually, without knowing you are delivering a grenade. Tess called Maren that night, not to ask how she was doing. The words came through the phone like something thrown. You let Lena sell Dad's boat without calling me. Maren opened her mouth and nothing came. What could she say? That Lena had handled it. That Maren had been sitting at the kitchen table in a fog of grief, so thick she could barely remember to eat, let alone manage a negotiation about the boat. That she had not called Tess because calling Tess required a kind of energy. She did not have the energy of navigating a daughter's anger while drowning in her own loss. She said none of it. The silence filled the line, then a click. And the line was dead, and Maren sat holding the phone in the kitchen of a house she no longer owned, listening to the dial tone the way you listen to a door closing in a house where all the doors are already closed. 3 months of silence followed. No calls, no texts. Maren sent one message in February. I love you, Tess. No reply. The cottage sold in March. A couple from Richmond who wanted a vacation rental. They walked through the rooms with a contractor talking about opening up the floor plan and adding a deck. And Maren stood in the kitchen and listened to them discuss the demolition of Padraig's oak table and the replacement of Amon's gas stove and the removal of the window above the sink, the window where the light came up over the sound to make room for a larger opening with a better view. They meant the same view. They just wanted more of it. Maren left before they finished. The Maeve Sea sold in April. Virginia Beach. The charter captain. The name he promised to keep. And then Maren was standing on the bench at Hatteras Harbor with a canvas sea bag and a ticking clock, and $120,000 she would not spend, and $10 she had earned that morning, and the slip was empty, and the light was flat, and she was 68 years old, and she did not know where to go. She rented a room above the fish house in Hatteras Village, $400 a month. A single bed, a hot plate, a window that looked out on the dumpsters behind the ice machine. She took a job mending nets at the same fish house, $14 an hour. The work was familiar. Thread, needle, mesh. Her hands knew the motions the way her lungs knew breathing automatically without instruction. Each repair a small act of making whole that satisfied something in her that the rest of her life was not satisfying. She was 68. Her hands were still steady in the mornings. By afternoon, the left shoulder ached and the needle felt heavier, and the mesh seemed to tighten, and she would stop and flex her fingers and stare at them, as though asking them a question she was not ready to ask herself. She kept the green ledger on the shelf above the hot plate in her rented room, not Maeve's ledger that she had taken from the cottage wrapped in a dish towel and placed in the sea bag beside the clock, but her own ledger, the 30-year continuation. She opened it some evenings after work, not to write in. There was nothing to write, no fish, no sales, no running balance, but to look at the last entry she had made before Cormac died. A Tuesday in November, 14 pounds of king mackerel at $6.20 a pound, total $86.80. The running balance of a life that no longer existed was an archaeological artifact, not a financial instrument. On a warm evening in late May, Maren sat on the dock behind the fish house with the sea bag beside her and a borrowed laptop on her knees. The sun was low over Pamlico Sound, the water turning copper. the marsh grass catching the last angled light in a way that made each blade look individually lit, as though the marsh were a cathedral and each blade of grass a candle. She was not looking at the sunset. She was looking at the Dare County surplus property page. The listing was buried between a decommissioned water tank and a lot of salvaged dock pilings. An abandoned United States Coast Guard life-saving station on a barrier island 9 miles north of Hatteras, accessible only by boat or by a sand road that flooded at high tide. Built in 1911 by the U.S. Life-Saving Service, transferred to the Coast Guard in 1915, manned continuously until 1958, vacant since. The Dare County Historical Commission had walked away from the building in 2014. Asking price $10. The photograph showed a weathered shingle-sided building on a low dune above the ocean, a square signal tower rising from the center of the roof, its lantern housing missing, torn off by a hurricane. In 1996, the listing said never replaced. A wide boat ramp descending toward the beach, a row of small windows along the second floor. The shingles had gone silver with salt, the color of driftwood, the color of things that have been left outside long enough to become part of the weather. Maren looked at the photograph for a long time. She did not know why it held her. It was not beautiful. It was not charming. It was a building that looked like it had been arguing with the Atlantic Ocean for 115 years and had not lost but had not won either. It looked like a thing that was waiting, not waiting for a buyer, waiting for someone to come and stay. She called the Dare County clerk's office in Manteo the next morning. The clerk was a woman in her late 70s named Mrs. Etheridge, who had worked in the office for more than 25 years and who answered the phone with the slow courtesy of a person who has been answering the same phone for so long that she no longer notices the ringing, only the silence when it stops. Maren gave her name. She said she wanted to purchase the surplus property, the old life-saving station on the barrier island. Mrs. Etheridge was quiet for a moment. Then she asked Maren to spell her last name. Maren spelled it. Calloway. Another pause. Then Mrs. Etheridge spoke, and her voice had changed, not warmer exactly, but more specific. The voice of a woman who has just placed a face on a name she has known for a long time without knowing it. I knew your husband. He sold flounder to my uncle's fish house for 20 years. Maren drove to Manteo the next day. Mrs. Etheridge was waiting with the deed on her desk already prepared. She stamped it without asking questions. She handed Maren the iron key, heavy forged, the kind of key from a century when people locked doors by hand and opened them by hand, and nothing was automatic. Mrs. Etheridge looked at Maren over the top of her reading glasses with an expression that was not pity and not admiration, but something closer to recognition. The expression of a woman who has lived on these islands long enough to know why a Calloway would buy a life-saving station on a barrier island for $10 and who did not need it explained. Because the explanation was the same explanation that had governed life on the Outer Banks for 100 years. You find a place that needs keeping, and you keep it. Maren walked to her truck in the parking lot of the Dare County offices. She sat in the driver's seat with the iron key in her right hand and the engine off. The key was warm from Mrs. Etheridge's office, heavy. It felt like a commitment that had already been made by someone else a long time ago, and she was just now picking it up. She started the truck. She drove south toward Hatteras, toward the fish house, toward the borrowed skiff that would take her across the sound, to an island she had never visited, to a building she had seen only in a photograph carrying a key that fit a lock she had never turned. The road was Highway 12, the only road on the Outer Banks. A 2-lane strip of asphalt running between the ocean and the sound, with nothing on either side but sand and grass and sky. The sky was enormous. It always was on Hatteras. And for the first time in months, Maren Calloway was driving towards something instead of away from it. The skiff crossed Pamlico Sound on a Saturday morning in early June, cutting a white line through water so flat it held the sky like a second atmosphere beneath the hull. 45 minutes of salt wind and marsh smell, And the particular silence of open water at 7 in the morning, when the fishermen were already out, and the pleasure boaters were not yet awake, and the sound belonged to the herons and the mullet, and the single woman in a borrowed skiff heading north toward an island she had never set foot on. The station appeared first as a dark shape against the dune line, then as geometry. The square tower, the pitch roof, the horizontal porch, and then as the skiff nosed into the shallows beside the old boat ramp as a building. Real, present, larger than the photograph had suggested, and more damaged. The boat ramp's concrete was cracked and colonized by sea oats. The porch sagged in 2 places. A section of gutter hung from the south eave like a broken arm, but the frame was plumb. The walls were straight. Whatever the ocean had done to the skin of this building over 115 years, it had not broken the bones. Maren tied the skiff to a piling at the base of the ramp and climbed the dune path to the porch. The boards groaned under her weight, testing but held. At the top of the porch steps, she stopped. On the nearest porch column at about eye height, someone had carved 4 letters into the wood with a knife or a nail. The cuts were old, nearly the same silver as the surrounding wood, and she had to trace them with her fingertip to be sure of what they said. HRG. She did not know whose initials they were. She would know within the hour. The front door required both hands on the iron key, a full turn and a shove with her shoulder, and then it swung inward with a sound like a held breath releasing. The ground floor opened before her. A single large room, the old crew quarters and mess hall. Plank floor wide boards, the gaps between them dark with a century of sand and salt. Beadboard walls painted a Coastguard white that had faded to the color of old milk. A brick fireplace at the south end, the mortar joints eroded on the ocean-facing side. The top courses leaning slightly outward in a way that looked tired rather than dangerous. Though Maren knew from 47 years of living with deteriorating structures that tired and dangerous were often the same thing on a delay. In the center of the room, a table, heavy, oak, 3 inches thick. The kind of table built to seat 8 men eating in silence before a night patrol, and still here, still level, still waiting. A narrow staircase climbed to the 2nd floor. 3 small rooms, the keeper's quarters, and 2 surfmen's berths with low ceilings and plaster walls that had cracked along the stud lines like dry riverbeds. The windows were intact, salt-fogged but unbroken, and through them Maren could see in one direction the Atlantic white-capped and restless, and in the other Pamlico Sound, flat and patient, and the contrast struck her the way it always struck people who came to the Outer Banks. For the first time, 2 bodies of water, with completely different temperaments, separated by a strip of sand narrow enough that you could hear both of them at once. Above the 2nd floor, a final ladder, iron rungs bolted to the wall, 12 of them steep as a ship's companionway. Maren climbed. The 7th rung was loose under her foot. The bolt corroded and she gripped the sides of the ladder with both hands and placed her weight, carefully aware of her age in a way she was not usually aware of. It aware of the distance between her body and the floor below, aware that if she fell, there was no one on this island to hear it. She did not fall. She reached the top and pulled herself through the hatch into the signal room, 8 feet by 8 feet. A small square chamber at the top of the tower. Windows on all 4 sides, floor to ceiling, and the light that came through them was not the light of a room, but the light of the sky itself, unfiltered, oceanic. The kind of light that makes you feel not illuminated, but exposed. A brass signal lamp mount was bolted to the ceiling, green with patina, its socket empty. The lantern housing that had once enclosed this room's upper half, the glass and iron structure that had made the tower visible to ships at sea, was gone, torn away by a hurricane in 1996, leaving only the bolt holes in the ceiling joists and a faint rectangular scar where the housing's base had sat. Against the east wall, bolted to the studs with heavy iron brackets, stood a tall, narrow iron cabinet. The signal flag locker. Maren recognized it from her years on the water. The old life-saving service had used these lockers to store the international signal flags that the surfmen flew from the tower to communicate with ships offshore. Each flag a letter, each letter a message, the whole system, a language of cloth and wind that predated radio and had outlasted the men who spoke it. The locker's door was rusted shut. Maren pulled the flat pry bar from the sea bag Cormac's bar, the one he had used to lever open ice chest lids on the Maeve Sea, its blade worn into a curve that fit his grip, and now fit hers, because her hands had become over the decades nearly the same size as his from doing the same work. She set the bar's edge in the seam of the door, leaned. The rust resisted, then gave with a sound like a small bone breaking. The door swung open. Inside, 12 signal flags on small brass clips, each labeled with its flag letter, Alpha through Lima. The fabric had been cotton once dyed in the bold primary colors of the international code red, blue, yellow, white. Now they were all the same, exhausted, brown-gray, moth-eaten brittle, the colors not faded so much as surrendered. The remaining 14 flags Mike through Zulu were missing. She almost closed the locker. Her hand was on the door. There was nothing here except old cloth and old brass and the smell of rust and mothball. But she noticed the way she noticed things, not by looking, but by feeling the geometry of a space, the way a carpenter's daughter feels. Whether a shelf is level without reaching for a level, that the back panel of the locker was not flush with the wall. There was a gap, 3 inches maybe less, between the iron back and the beadboard behind it. She reached in past the flags. The old cotton brushed her forearm like dry fingers. Her hand went through the gap and into darkness, and her fingertips found wood. A shelf, small, maybe 8 inches wide, mounted directly to the wall, studs behind the locker. Invisible from the front, invisible from the sides. Accessible only by reaching past the signal flags into a space that no one who did not know this building intimately would think to explore. 3 objects on the shelf. She brought them out one at a time, carefully, the way you bring things out of the ground when you do not yet know what they are. A leather-bound logbook. The leather was stiff. The stitching hand done, the spine cracked but intact. A canvas pouch heavy in her palm, the weight concentrated and shifting the weight of metal of coins. A letter. Heavy cream paper folded, once sealed with a small blob of something black and hard. Tar. Ship's tar, the kind the old Coastguard stations had used to waterproof rigging and seal seams, repurposed here as a wax seal by a man who apparently did not have wax. Maren carried them down the iron ladder, one hand on the rungs, the other cradling the 3 objects against her chest. Down through the 2nd floor, down the narrow staircase, into the ground floor crew quarters where the morning light was now pouring through the oceanside windows and falling across the heavy oak table in long pale rectangles. She set the objects on the table. She sat on the bench. Her hands had stopped trembling, or rather, they were trembling at a different frequency now. Not the tremor of loss, but the tremor of proximity to something she did not yet understand. She opened the logbook first. The first page, U.S. Life-Saving Station number 24. Log of operations commenced January 1st, 1911. The handwriting on this page was formal, upright, the penmanship of a man who understood that an official record was a form of oath. Each entry logged a date, a weather observation, a sea state, and when applicable, a rescue. The entries were spare. The language was the language of men who had been trained to report what happened without editorializing about what it meant. 6 successive keepers had written in this logbook across 47 years. 6 different hands, 6 different pressures of pen on paper. 6 men who had climbed the same ladder Maren had just climbed and looked out the same windows at the same ocean and written down what they saw. The early entries 1911 through the 1920s were in a careful copper plate. The 1930s shifted to a blunter hand. The 1940s, the war years became terser, the entries shorter, the weather observations sharper, as though the keeper had learned that brevity was a form of vigilance. She turned to the final entry, September 30th, 1958. The handwriting was straight, clear, unhurried, the script of a man who knew this was the last thing he would write in this book and wanted it to be legible for whoever came after. Station decommissioned today per USCG District 5 order. Final watch stood by keeper H.R. Gaskins, 0600 to 1800. No vessels in distress. Sea state 2. Wind northeast 8 knots. Clear. This station has saved 341 lives in 47 years of operation. I am the last keeper. Howard Raymond Gaskins, boatswain's mate, Chief United States Coast Guard. HRG. The initials on the porch column. He had carved his name into the building on his way out the way a man signs a letter he knows will not be answered. She opened the canvas pouch. Gold coins spilled onto the oak table with a sound she had never heard before. Not the clink of pocket change, but a heavier, duller, more serious sound. The sound of weight. 28 coins, Liberty Double Eagles. Each one slightly larger than a silver dollar. Each one stamped with a date from the 1940s and 1950s. She picked one up. It was heavier than she expected, nearly an ounce. She held it in her palm and felt the density of it, the particular gravity of gold, which is not like the weight of any other metal, because it feels warmer as though the metal itself is generating heat. 28 coins, nearly 2 pounds. She did not know their value yet. She would learn later, approximately $58,000. She set the coins aside. She picked up the letter. The tar seal cracked away in a single clean piece separating from the paper, without tearing it. Tar was better than wax. Gaskins had known that. A man who spent 17 years sealing boats would know what sealed and what did not. The letter was written on both sides of a single sheet of heavy cream paper, in the same hand as the final logbook entry. She read it. To whoever finds this, my name is Howard Gaskins. I have served as keeper of this station from June of 1941 until today. The 30th of September, 1958. I am 51 years old. Tomorrow I will close this station and transfer to a desk posting in Elizabeth City that I do not want. I have kept this station through 17 years. That included the war, during which we patrolled this beach for German submarines every night in all weathers, and the hurricanes of 1944 and 1954, and 341 rescues of fishermen and sailors and pleasure boaters, and one child on a rubber raft who had drifted 2 miles offshore from a beach in Nag's Head, and who was, when we reached him, singing a song about a whale. The gold is what I have saved from my Coast Guard salary across 17 years. I did not trust banks after what happened to my father's savings in 1933. I hid the coins behind the signal flag locker because the locker is bolted to the wall with iron brackets, and no person who does not know this station intimately would think to reach behind it. The logbook belongs to this station, and I cannot bring myself to surrender it to the district office in Elizabeth City, where it will be filed in a cabinet and forgotten. I do not know who will find this shelf. I hope it is a person who knows the water. I hope it is a person who has stood a watch. I hope it is a person who understands that a life-saving station is not a building. A life-saving station is a promise that someone is paying attention. If you are that person, this station is yours now. Keep the light. Howard R. Gaskins, Boatswain's Mate, Chief, USCG, September 30th, 1958. Maren read the letter twice, then a third time, then a fourth. Then she placed it on the oak table, laid both palms flat on the wood on either side of it, and cried. She cried for about 2 minutes, alone in the crew quarters of a life-saving station that had been empty for nearly 70 years, with the morning ocean light coming through the windows and the sound of the Atlantic on the beach below, and a letter from a dead man lying between her hands. She was not crying for Gaskins. She was not crying for herself. She was crying because the letter had said the thing she had been unable to say since Cormac died. The thing she had been carrying in her chest like a stone she could not swallow, and could not spit out, that paying attention was not a job. It was a promise. And she had failed to pay attention to her own husband's dying, and the guilt of that failure had been sitting in her ribcage for 7 months, and Gaskin's letter had reached through nearly 70 years of silence and touched it. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She did not apologize to anyone for the crying. Cormac had cried exactly once in her presence on the dock at Hatteras Harbour. The morning after Hurricane Isabel in 2003, when he found the Maeve Sea still in her slip, undamaged, surrounded by the wreckage of 6 boats that had not survived the storm surge. 30 seconds. Then he started bailing water from the cockpit. She had understood that morning a thing about the Calloways that no one ever said out loud, that grief and labor occupied adjacent rooms in the same house, and you moved between them without ceremony. She spoke aloud to the empty station, to the fireplace, to the oak table, to the light. "Thank you, Chief Gaskins. I will keep the light." 3 weeks later, the first storm hit. It was not a hurricane. It was a tropical depression that the forecast models had pushed north of Cape Hatteras, away from the island, out to sea. The models were wrong. The depression stalled, wobbled south, and crossed the barrier island at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, with sustained winds of 60 miles per hour, and rain so heavy that the air itself seemed to have changed state, not falling water, but a solid wall of it, horizontal, slamming into the west-facing windows with a sound like continuous applause. Maren was alone on the island. No cell signal, no radio. No one knew she was there. She had been sleeping on a cot in the keeper's quarters on the 2nd floor, and she woke to the sound of the roof leaving. Not all of it. 3 shingle panels on the northwest corner ripped free and flung into the dark. The rain came through the gap and hit the 2nd floor hallway in a torrent that ran down the stairs and pooled in the crew quarters below. She grabbed the sea bag. She grabbed the logbook. The coins, the letter, she had kept them on the table and sealed them in a dry bag she used for fishing. She climbed the iron ladder to the signal room. The 7th rung shifted under her foot, and she gripped the rails so hard her knuckles ached for 2 days afterward. The signal room was the highest point. If the water rose, it would be the last place to flood. She sat on the floor with her back against the flag locker, the sea bag between her knees, the brass clock ticking inside the canvas, and she listened to the storm take apart the building beneath her piece by piece. The windows shook in their frames. The tower swayed not much, an inch or 2 at the peak, but enough to feel in her stomach the way you feel a boat roll in a beam sea. The wind found every crack in the old wood and turned each one into a whistle, so that the tower was producing a chord, a low atonal moan that rose and fell with the gusts. She held the clock against her chest and felt it sticking against her sternum. Mechanical and indifferent marking time, without caring what the time contained. She had been on the water in storms before. She had ridden out northeasters on the Maeve Sea with Cormac at the helm, the bow punching through 6-foot swells, the windshield streaming, the engine roaring against the current. But Cormac had always been there. Cormac between her and the ocean. Eamon's knowledge in Cormac's hands. 4 generations of understanding between the Calloway family and the Atlantic. A negotiation conducted over a century each generation, learning the terms and passing them down. Now there was no one between Maren and the sea. No Cormac, no Eamon, no Padraig. Just a 68-year-old woman sitting on the floor of a tower, on a barrier island in a storm, holding a brass clock and discovering something she had known, but never had to live. The ocean did not hate her. The ocean did not love her. The ocean did not know she existed. And that indifference, not the violence, not the wind, not the water, was the most frightening thing she had ever encountered. Cormac had known this his whole life. He had never said it because there was no way to say it. You had to sit in it alone. Dawn came grey and exhausted. The wind dropped. The rain thinned to a mist, and then to nothing. Maren climbed down from the signal room, the 7th rung held barely, and surveyed the damage. 3 roof panels gone. The 2nd floor soaked. The staircase slick. But the frame stood. The walls stood. The oak table in the crew quarters had a 1/4 inch of water on it, and she wiped it dry with her sleeve and set the logbook and the letter and the coins back on it. And they sat there in the pale post-storm light, as though nothing had happened, because to them nothing had. She started cleaning. There was nothing else to do. The second blow came not from the weather, but from a man in leather shoes. 2 weeks after the storm, a boat from Manteo pulled up to the ramp. 2 men climbed out. One was a building inspector named Harris, a quiet, competent man with a clipboard and a tape measure, and the permanent squint of someone who has spent his career looking at structures that are trying to fall down. The other was Dale Burkhart, mid-50s, County Development Office. Khaki pants, blue Oxford shirt, leather shoes that collected sand with every step which he brushed off twice before reaching the porch. He carried a binder with the Dare County seal on the cover, and the expression of a man who has been planning something for a long time and has just discovered an obstacle he did not expect. Burkhardt had been watching this island before Maren bought the station. He had been assembling a proposal for an ecotourism development boardwalk. Nature trails, a bird observation platform, guided kayak tours, and the old life-saving station sat at the geographic center of his plan. The county had sold the station for $10 because the county believed no one would buy it. Burkhardt had believed the same. The station would sit vacant, deteriorate further, and eventually the county would condemn it and authorize demolition, clearing the site for the boardwalk's central hub. Maren's $10 purchase had landed in the middle of Burkhardt's timeline like a nail in a tire. Harris inspected the building for 3 hours. He measured load-bearing walls. He tested the chimney with a plumb line. He climbed to the second floor and pressed his thumb into the window frames and checked the stair treads for rot. He climbed the iron ladder Maren warned him about the 7th rung and examined the signal room ceiling joists. He came down and wrote his report on the clipboard in a handwriting that was nearly as compressed as Cormac's. The verdict: structurally compromised. Not condemned, not yet, but classified as unsafe for human habitation. The south chimney's mortar was eroded to a depth of nearly an inch on the ocean side, with the top 4 courses leaning outward at an angle that would not survive another hurricane season. The roof needed 30% replacement. The electrical system, original 1950s wiring, was a fire hazard. The plumbing was non-functional. The iron ladder 7th rung was a liability. The county would give Maren 90 days to bring the station up to code. If she failed, the county would revoke the occupancy permit and issue a demolition order. Burkhardt delivered this information on the porch, his leather shoes planted on the boards Maren had swept that morning, his voice carrying the smooth professional courtesy of a man who understood that politeness was a more effective weapon than hostility. "Mrs. Calloway, I understand you have an attachment to this building. But the reality is that it doesn't meet code, and the county has a responsibility to public safety." Maren looked at him. She recognized the language. It was the same language Lena had used in the kitchen of the cottage. The language of people who were right about the procedure and wrong about everything the procedure could not measure. She did not argue. She asked Harris one question. "If I fix everything on your list in 90 days, I keep the building." Harris glanced at Burkhardt. Burkhardt's jaw tightened, a small motion, the kind of motion a man makes when a situation he expected to control has just slipped slightly out of his grip. Harris looked back at Maren and nodded. Maren nodded back. The two men walked down the porch steps across the sand and climbed into their boat. Burkhardt looked back once. Maren was still standing on the porch. She did not wave. That night, she sat at the oak table with the green ledger open. Her ledger, the continuation of Maeve's system, and a pencil. She had not written in this ledger since the last entry before Cormac died. The pencil felt heavy. She turned to a fresh page. At the top in the left column, she wrote the date. In the second column, where Maeve would have written the species of fish, she wrote Repair Life-Saving Station number 24. In the third column, where Maeve would have written the pounds, she wrote Budget. In the fourth, where Maeve would have written the price per pound, she wrote $120,000. In the fifth, where Maeve would have written the total, she wrote Purpose. In the sixth, where Maeve would have written the running balance, she wrote 2 words: Keep the light. She was spending the money, the Calloway money, 4 generations of it. She was spending it not on herself, but on a building that had spent 47 years saving fishermen and 68 years waiting for someone to save it back. The logic closed like a circuit. The money that fishing had earned would rescue the station that had rescued fishermen. Maeve would have understood the math. She did not touch the gold. The 28 Liberty Double Eagles stayed in the canvas pouch on the table. They belonged to Gaskins. They belonged to the station. They were not hers to spend. The chimney came first. She called Walt Frazier, a retired mason from Rodantha mid-70s who had spent 20 years maintaining the brickwork on the Cape Hatteras lighthouse, and who answered his phone on the second ring and listened to her describe the chimney and said he would come out on Saturday. He came. He looked at the chimney for a long time, his eyes moving over the mortar joints the way a doctor's eyes move over a wound, reading the damage, estimating the depth, calculating the intervention. He taught Maren to mix a Portland-based mortar rated for salt exposure, thinner than standard, pressed into the joints, with a narrow trowel smoothed with a wet wooden slat. She built a wooden scaffold against the south wall, 16 feet high, lashed with rope, the kind of scaffold she had seen Cormac build against the hull of the Maeve Sea when he scraped barnacles. 3 weeks in July. On the scaffold in the Outer Banks, heat the sun directly overhead at noon, the brick radiating warmth that she could feel through her gloves. Her left shoulder protested every afternoon. Her hands ached by evening. One afternoon on the scaffold, she felt the world tilt, not the scaffold moving, but her balance shifting. A dizziness that started behind her eyes and spread to her stomach. And she sat down on the scaffold planks and stared at the ocean 15 feet below and waited for the horizon to stop rotating. It stopped after 5 minutes. She stood and went back to work. But the question Cormac's death had planted in her, the question about whether she was keeping the light or burning herself out, flickered in her chest like a pilot light that would not go fully dark. The roof came next. 2 roofers from Manteo Brothers who arrived by boat with a load of cedar shingles and worked for a week replacing the damaged 30%. The electrical followed a licensed electrician from Manteo who rewired the entire building and charged twice what Maren had budgeted, because the 1950s wiring was not merely outdated, but actively dangerous. The insulation crumbling, the junction boxes corroded. The plumbing required new pipes, a new pump, a new water heater. Each repair spawned secondary repairs. Each budget line exceeded its estimate. Maren tracked it all in the green ledger. The numbers marching down the column, each one smaller than the one above it. The running balance declining like a tide that only goes out. By the 8th week, the balance was $35,000. She needed at least 50 to finish. The ledger did not lie. The ledger had never lied. That was the point of the ledger. She was sitting on the porch on a Tuesday evening, the green ledger open on her knees, the numbers staring back at her with the patient brutality of arithmetic, when she heard the outboard. A skiff coming across the sound from the south. Not a fisherman's skiff. The engine was too high-pitched, too fast, the sound of a smaller boat being pushed hard. The skiff rounded the south point of the island and came into view. One person at the helm, a woman, dark hair pulled back, shoulders squared. The posture of a person heading towards something she was not sure she wanted to reach, but was going to reach anyway. Tess cut the engine and drifted the last 30 feet to the ramp. She tied the skiff, and Maren, standing on the porch, looked down and saw her daughter's hands make the flat spiral coil on the piling cleat. Not the figure eight, the flat spiral. The way Cormac had taught her when she was 6 years old. The lesson delivered in silence, the correction made by doing, not by telling. Tess had not been on this island before. She had not been in her mother's presence for 5 months. But her hands remembered what her mouth would not say. Tess climbed the ramp. She stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the building, the scaffold, the new mortar on the chimney, the fresh cedar shingles mixed in with the silver-gray originals. The whole patchwork evidence of a 68-year-old woman working alone in hurricane season. She looked at Maren, at her mother's hands dusted with mortar, at her left shoulder sitting lower than her right, at the lines around her eyes that had deepened since the funeral. You need a mechanic, not an apology, not a reconciliation. A question in the language the Calloways spoke, the language of work, which was the only language this family had ever trusted to carry the weight of what they actually meant. Maren stepped aside. Tess walked in. Tess spent the first day inspecting. She moved through the building the way she moved through an engine compartment, systematically touching surfaces, testing joints, pressing her thumb into wood the way Harris had, but with a mechanic's understanding that a structure like an engine tells you where it hurts if you listen with your hands. She checked the floor joists, the roof beams, the iron ladder. She replaced the seventh rung's bolt with a stainless steel one she had brought in her tool bag without being asked, because she had been a mechanic long enough to know that you fix the thing that can kill someone before you fix the thing that looks bad. That evening, Tess sat at the oak table, the same table where Maren had read Gaskin's letter and laid out her assessment. The building needed at least 40,000 more to pass inspection. Maren had 35. Tess reached into her back pocket and put a folded check on the table. $12,000. Her savings. It's not enough. But if I do the plumbing and the mechanical work myself, you don't have to pay a contractor. Maren looked at the check. She looked at her daughter. The distance between them was not the distance it had been in November. It was not yet closeness. It was the distance between two people who have been in separate boats on the same body of water and have just realized they are heading for the same dock. They worked. Days bled into weeks. Maren on the scaffold, Tess under the floor. Maren repointing brick, Tess soldering pipe. They communicated in the short end of tools, 3/4 wrench pipe cutter. The drain line under the second bathroom needs a new elbow. The same sparse grammar Cormac and Maren had spoken on the Maeve Sea for 47 years. The same language Eamon and Maeve had spoken before them. A family's dialect passed down not through words, but through the act of handing someone the right tool at the right time without being asked. One evening they sat on the porch too tired to eat, watching the last light drain from the sound. Tess spoke without turning her head, her voice aimed at the water, as though the question were easier to ask if it were not aimed at a person. Why did Dad hide the mortgage from you? Maren let the question sit for a long time. The sound darkened. A heron crossed the marsh flat in a slow diagonal, its wing beats so unhurried they seemed voluntary, as though flying were a choice the bird was making, one stroke at a time. I don't know. He's gone, so I'll never know. Does it make you angry? Maren thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. The anger was there. It had been there since Lena opened the leather folder. But it was not the largest thing in the room. No, it makes me sad. Because it means he thought he had to carry it alone. And I was right there. The silence after that sentence had a different texture than the silences before it, not empty but full. The way a room is full after someone has opened a window and the air has changed. Tess's voice came quieter. I was in Beaufort for 5 years and you never told me he was slowing down. And there it was, the mirror. The same failure reflected between mother and daughter. Carrying alone because carrying alone felt like love. Protecting people from worry by denying them the chance to help. The Calloway inheritance that had nothing to do with boats or fish or the ocean. The inheritance of silence, of self-sufficiency so total that it became its own kind of isolation. Neither of them apologized. No Calloway had ever apologized with words. But the next morning Tess was awake at 4:30, standing on the porch with a coffee mug, looking east, waiting for the light to come up over the Atlantic, the way Cormac had waited for it every morning of his life. Maren saw her from the second-floor window and understood. The Calloways did not say sorry. The Calloways said sorry by showing up before dawn. Day 87. Harris arrived by boat at 9 in the morning. Burkhardt was with him. Leather shoes, binder. The same smooth expression, slightly tighter around the jaw than it had been 90 days ago, the expression of a man who has done the math and believes the math is on his side. Harris inspected for 4 hours. Chimney mortar repointed, top courses realigned past. Roof 30% replaced with matched cedar. Flashing seal past, electrical full rewire, new panel grounded past. Plumbing new supply lines, new pump functional past. Iron ladder all rungs tested, 7th rung replaced past. Structural integrity joist sound, load-bearing walls intact past. 2 items remained. The porch railing which needed replacement on the ocean side. The second floor emergency egress which needed a code-compliant window. Harris wrote in his report that he would grant a 30-day extension for these 2 items. Burkhardt stepped forward, his voice still courteous but thinner now, the courtesy wearing through. Harris, I think we need to look more carefully at the foundation drainage on the east side. Harris closed his clipboard. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Dale, the building passes. I'm signing the report. Burkhardt looked at Maren. She was standing on the porch, Tess behind her. Both of them salt-stained and mortar-dusted, and wearing the particular exhaustion of people who have not slept a full night in 3 weeks. Maren held his gaze. She did not speak. She did not need to. She was standing on the porch of a building she had saved with her own hands and her daughter's hands and the money of 4 generations of her family. And the building was standing, and she was standing, and Burkhardt's ecotourism boardwalk was going to have to find a different center. He turned. He walked down the steps, his leather shoes filled with sand. He climbed into the county boat without brushing them off. The boat pulled away from the ramp, and Maren watched it cross the Sound until it was a white dot on the flat grey water. And then it was nothing. Tess put a hand on Maren's shoulder. The left one, the one that ached, and left it there for a moment. She did not squeeze. She did not pat. She just rested her hand there, the warmth of her palm on the muscle that had been hurting for months. And Maren felt the warmth go through her shirt and into her skin, and down into the ache itself. Not curing it, but acknowledging it the way you acknowledge a debt you intend to honor. That evening, Maren opened the green ledger and updated the balance. $15,247. Below the number, she wrote a note in the margin outside the columns, the first time she had ever written outside Maeve's system. Enough for 6 months, if no storms. She closed the ledger. The gold sat in its pouch on the table. 28 coins, $58,000, untouched. She would find another way. The station opened to the public in the spring of Maren's 2nd year on the island. She did not hold a ceremony. She did not cut a ribbon. She posted a handwritten notice on the bulletin board at the Hatteras Fish House and another at the marina in Ocracoke. And she told the woman who ran the bait shop at Oregon Inlet, who told everyone she sold bait to, which was everyone. The notice read, Life-saving station number 24, Barrier Island, 9 miles north of Hatteras. Open to visitors by boat, free. Come see where 341 lives were saved. Tess had built the display case from driftwood she collected on the beach below the station across 3 January weekends, hauling planks of water-smoothed oak up the dune path and assembling them on the crew quarters floor with wood glue and brass screws salvaged from a decommissioned dock in Avon. The case sat on the heavy oak table in the center of the room. Inside it, under glass, Gaskin's logbook opened to the final entry. Beside it, the letter unfolded, the tar seal fragment placed next to it like a small black stone. Maren had debated whether to display the letter. It was a private document written by a man who had not expected it to be read by strangers. But she decided that Gaskins had written it to whoever found it, and whoever found it had opened a station to the public, and the public was now part of whoever. The letter deserved to be read by the people it had been waiting for. The gold stayed in the canvas pouch in a locked drawer in the keeper's quarters upstairs. It was not on display. It was not for sale. It was Gaskin's savings and Gaskin's trust. And Maren would no sooner sell it than she would sell the logbook or the letter or the brass lamp mount on the ceiling of the signal room. Some things belong to a place, not a person, and their value was not measured in dollars but in the fact of their remaining. The first visitors came on a Saturday in April. A family from Ocracoke. a father, a mother. Two boys under 10 who tied their skiff at the ramp and climbed the dune path and stood in the crew quarters looking at the logbook. The way people look at things that are older than their grandparents, with a mixture of reverence and disbelief, as though age itself were a kind of achievement. The father read the final entry aloud to his sons, his finger tracing the words through the glass. And when he reached the number 341 lives, the younger boy looked up at Maren and asked how many people that was. Maren considered several answers and chose the one that would make sense to a 7-year-old. Do you know 341 people? The boy shook his head. Neither do I. That's how many. The school groups came next. A fourth-grade class from Cape Hatteras Elementary arrived on a chartered boat in May. 14 children and a teacher named Mrs. Rollins, who had been teaching on Hatteras for 22 years and who understood without being told that the station was not a museum. In the conventional sense, it was not a place where things were preserved behind glass for looking at. It was a place where things were preserved behind glass because someone was still using the building. They were preserved in still sleeping upstairs, still sweeping the porch, still climbing the tower, still keeping watch. Mrs. Rollins let the children sit on the bench at the oak table and write their names in a guest book Maren had placed beside the display case, and one girl wrote not her name but a question. Who is standing watch now? Maren read it after the children left and did not write an answer, because the answer was obvious and because writing it down would have made it smaller. The old Coastguardsmen came in June. Two men in their early 80s, both retired, both former surfmen, who had served at other stations on the Outer Banks in the early 1960s, a few years after Gaskins' station had been decommissioned. They arrived in a center console from Wanchese, their movements slow and deliberate on the dock, their bodies carrying the particular stiffness of men who had spent their youth in violent water and were now paying the tax. They climbed the dune path without speaking. They entered the crew quarters without speaking. They read the logbook and the letter without speaking. Then they climbed the iron ladder slowly, one rung at a time, hands gripping, and stood in the signal room and looked out the 4 windows at the ocean and the sound and the island stretching north and south. And they stood there for a long time in a silence that was not the silence of people who had nothing to say, but the silence of people who were saying it in a language that did not use words. When they came down, one of them, a tall man with hands like dock cleats, scarred and oversized, stopped at the display case and placed his palm flat on the glass above the logbook, not touching the book, but covering it the way you place your hand over a wound. He looked at Maren. You're doing the right thing. That was all. They left. In late July, the Outer Banks Sentinel ran a short article about the station's restoration and its opening as a public heritage site. The article included a photograph of the logbook's final entry and a quote from Mrs. Etheridge at the county clerk's office, confirming that the property had been legally purchased and was now in full compliance with county building codes. The article did not mention Dale Burkhart by name. It did not need to. 3 weeks after the article ran, Maren received a letter from the Dare County Development Office, not from Burkhart, but from his supervisor, informing her that the proposed ecotourism trail project on the island had been restructured to accommodate existing historic structures. The boardwalk would route around the station, not through it. The letter was one paragraph bureaucratic, unsigned by anyone she recognized. She read it once, folded it, and placed it in the green ledger between the pages. The way Maeve used to press receipts between ledger entries, not as a keepsake, but as evidence that a number had been settled. Burkhart did not come back to the island. Maren did not expect him to. Men who wore leather shoes on sand were not the kind who returned to concede. They simply redirected the way water redirects around a piling, not because the water has accepted the piling, but because the piling is no longer worth the argument. The summer passed. Maren turned 69. She did not celebrate. She mended nets 3 days a week on the mainland to cover groceries and fuel for the skiff. The $15,000 in the bank account was a cushion she refused to sit on holding it for emergencies. A burst pipe, a broken window, the next storm. Tess had returned to Beaufort but came back to the island every other weekend, bringing tools and supplies and the quiet company of a daughter who had found in the physical labor of maintaining a building a way to be present with her mother that did not require navigating the emotional wreckage between them. They had not discussed the months of silence. They did not need to. The discussion was happening in the replaced shingles and the recorked windows and the Sunday mornings when Tess arrived at the dock before Maren was awake and had the coffee made by the time Maren came downstairs. In August, Tom Gaskins came. Maren heard the outboard from the signal room, where she had been cleaning the windows with vinegar and newspaper, the way Maren Calloway had cleaned the cottage windows every spring. The vinegar cutting the salt film, the newspaper leaving the glass so clear. It seemed to disappear, turning the windows into open air. She came down to the porch and watched a man in his early 60s climb out of a base boat at the ramp. He was tall, silver-haired, straight-backed in the way of someone whose posture had been corrected daily for 20 years and had never uncorrected itself. He wore a plain white shirt and khakis and boat shoes that had seen actual boats. He tied up at the piling and climbed the dune path and stopped at the porch steps and looked at the column where the 4 letters were carved. He raised his hand and placed his fingertips on the initials HRG the way you touch a headstone. His name was Tom Gaskins. He was the grandson of a surfman, a man named Walter Gaskins. No relation by blood to Howard, but a man who had served under Howard Gaskins at the station from 1952 to 1958, the last 6 years of its operation. Tom had driven from Norfolk that morning after reading the article in the Outer Banks Sentinel about a woman who had purchased the old station number 24 and restored it. The article had mentioned the logbook. Tom had not known the logbook still existed. Maren let him in. She watched him approach the display case the way she had watched the old Coastguardsman approach it in June, the slow walk, the lowered voice, the specific gravity that certain objects exert on certain people, pulling them forward and holding them still at the same time. Tom leaned over the glass and found his grandfather's name. Walter Gaskins. It appeared 7 times across 6 years of entries logged in Howard's straight hand, beside rescue reports and storm patrols, and the routine daily watches that made up the vast majority of a surfman's service. Each mention was brief, Surfman W. Gaskins on patrol, Surfman W. Gaskins assisted in rescue of vessel, the kind of notation that reduced a man's entire night to a single line. But the line was there. 7 times, 6 years. The proof that a man had stood in this building and done his job and been recorded doing it by a keeper who understood that recording was itself a form of rescue, saving a man's work from the amnesia of time. Tom climbed the iron ladder. He stood in the signal room for a long time, his hands at his sides, looking east through the window at the Atlantic. When he came down, his eyes were dry, but his voice was not the words carrying a slight thickening that Maren recognized because she had heard it in Cormac's voice on the rare occasions when Cormac was moved by something he could not fix. My grandfather said Keeper Gaskins was the best man he ever served with. He'd be glad to know you're here. Maren nodded. On the barrier islands among the families who had been there long enough, a nod after a statement like that was a complete conversation. It contained the acknowledgement, the gratitude, the shared understanding, and the agreement not to dilute any of it by adding more words. But Tom was not finished. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a folded piece of paper, a photocopy of an obituary from the Daily Advance, Elizabeth City, dated March 1971. Howard Raymond Gaskins, born 1907, Stumpy Point, North Carolina. Died March 14, 1971, Elizabeth City. Retired boatswain's mate, Chief United States Coast Guard. No surviving spouse, no children. Services held at the First Baptist Church of Elizabeth City. Burial at the church cemetery. Tom handed the photocopy to Maren. My grandfather kept this in his Bible. He went to the funeral. He said there were 8 people there, including the minister. Maren held the paper. No surviving spouse, no children. Howard Gaskins had served 17 years on this island, saved 341 lives, hidden his life savings behind a signal flag locker, written a letter to a stranger he would never meet, and died 13 years later in a town he did not want to live in, alone with 8 people at his funeral. The letter had not been a bequest. It had been a message in a bottle thrown into the future by a man who had no family to throw it to. The gold was not an inheritance. It was the last act of a man trying to make his life mean something beyond the years it occupied, trying to reach across the silence after his death and touch someone who would understand what he had spent his life doing. Maren refolded the obituary and handed it back. She did not trust herself to speak and did not try. Tom put it in his pocket and looked at the display case one more time, and then walked to the door and stopped. He never married, never had kids. My grandfather asked him once why. You know what he said? Tom paused not for effect but for accuracy, the pause of a man quoting something he has carried for a long time and wants to get right. He said, "This station is the only home I ever really had." Tom left. His bass boat crossed the sound and shrank to a white point and disappeared. Maren stood on the porch and watched it go and thought about a man who had lived alone in this building for 17 years and had called it the only home he ever really had, and who had sealed that home behind an iron locker for nearly 70 years waiting for someone to reach in and find it. He had not been waiting for a Calloway. He had not been waiting for a fisherman or a coastguardsman or a woman or a man. He had been waiting for someone who needed a home badly enough to reach into the dark. Lena called in late August. The conversation lasted 40 minutes, the longest phone call Maren and Lena had shared since before Cormac's death. Lena's voice was different, slower, less armored. She asked about the station's progress. She asked about the chimney and the roof and the inspection. She asked whether Maren was eating properly, a question that Maren recognized as a translation of the thing Lena actually wanted to say, which was, "I'm sorry I tried to put you in an apartment in Raleigh." Lena did not say it. Maren did not need her to. The question about eating was enough. Lena said she might drive down in October. Maren told her she would leave the skiff at the mainland dock. October came. Lena came with it. She crossed the Sound on a Sunday morning. The water flat, the sky, the pale silver blue of early fall on the outer banks. The color that meant the summer humidity had broken, and the light was changing from the heavy gold of August to the thinner, sharper, more honest light of autumn. The light that showed you things the summer light had hidden. Lena stepped off the skiff and walked up the ramp and stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at the building. She had not seen it before. She had not seen the chimney. Maren had repointed the shingles. Tess had helped replace the porch boards. Maren had reinforced the iron ladder Tess had repaired. She had not seen the oak table, or the display case, or the logbook, or the letter. She had seen only the numbers 120,000, reduced to 15 in the financial updates Maren occasionally provided by phone. Lena was a woman who understood buildings through spreadsheets. Now she was standing in front of one that could not be understood that way. She entered the crew quarters. She moved through the room, slowly touching the beadboard walls, the fireplace mantel, the bench at the oak table. She stood at the display case and read the logbook's final entry. Then she read Gaskin's letter. She read it once quickly, the way she read contracts. Then she read it again slowly, the way she had not read anything in years. Then she sat down on the bench and placed her hands flat on the table on either side of the display case, palms down, fingers spread. And she sat that way for a long time in the posture Maren had assumed months earlier, when she first read the letter. A posture that was not prayer and not grief, but something between them. The posture of a person who has been carrying a certainty about the world and has just felt that certainty shift. Lena's eyes did not overflow, but they filled, and the filling changed her face from the face of a commercial real estate professional into something older and younger. At the same time, the face of a girl who had once sat at a kitchen table on Hatteras Island and watched her grandmother write numbers in a green ledger and had not understood until this moment, sitting in a building her mother had saved, with those same numbers, what the numbers had been for. "Mom, I think I was wrong to tell you to come to Raleigh." Maren was standing by the fireplace. The bricks she had repointed were a slightly different color than the originals. The new mortar lighter, the old mortar salt, darkened, and the contrast made the chimney look like a document with annotations in a different hand. The same text continued by a new author. "You weren't wrong about the math, Lena. You were wrong about the geography." Lena opened her purse. She took out a check, folded once, and placed it on the table beside the display case. $20,000. Maren looked at it the way she had looked at Tess's $12,000 check 2 months ago, not with surprise, but with the specific recognition of a debt being repaid in a currency the debtor had chosen. "This is my share of the Calloway family. I sold the house. I made you sell the boat. This is how I give it back." Maren crossed the room. She reached up to the shelf above the makeshift kitchen she had assembled in the second-floor hallway. The hot plate, the coffee pot, the small refrigerator Tess had hauled over on the skiff, and brought down the green ledger. Her ledger. The continuation. She opened it to the page where she had been tracking the station's expenses and turned to a new line. She wrote the date. She wrote Lena Calloway. She wrote $20,000. In the column where Maeve would have written the purpose, she wrote, "Keep the light." Lena watched her write. Lena recognized the ledger, not this specific ledger, but the system, the columns, the handwriting that was not Maeve's, but followed Maeve's architecture. Lena's eyes went full. One tear fell. It landed on the table on the oak and sat there like a small clear coin. Tess arrived that afternoon. Maren had arranged it. She had not told Lena. Tess tied her skiff at the ramp, climbed the path, and walked through the front door, and found her sister sitting at the table. The two women had not been in the same room in more than 3 years. They had spoken by phone twice in that period, both conversations brief, both about logistics. The sale of the cottage, the division of proceeds conducted in the efficient, bloodless language of transactions, that both of them had used to avoid saying the things transactions cannot carry. Tess stood in the doorway. Lena sat at the table. The display case was between them, Gaskin's logbook open under glass, the letter beside it. Tess looked at Lena. Lena looked at Tess. "I should have called you before I sold the boat." Lena's voice was level factual, the admission delivered with the same precision she used for closing statements. But beneath it, audible only to someone who had grown up listening to Calloways try to say important things without sounding like they were saying important things. A current of something that was not quite regret and not quite apology, but the specific acknowledgement that a mistake had been made and could not be unmade, and the only remaining option was to say so. Tess was quiet for a long count. The sound of the Atlantic came through the windows, the low steady percussion of waves on sand that was the background noise of every conversation anyone had ever had in this building for 115 years. "Yeah, you should have." A pause. Then, "But you were right about the math." "I know, I'm always right about the math." Something moved across Tess's face. Not a smile, half of one. The half that arrives before the other half has decided whether it is safe. She stepped into the room and sat on the bench across from Lena, and they sat on opposite sides of the oak table with the display case between them, and the distance between them was not the distance it had been in November. It was not yet the closeness of the sisters they had been as children on Hatteras, sharing a bedroom in the shingled cottage, falling asleep to the same sound of the same ocean through the same window. But it was moving, slowly, the way a tide moves when it turns, not because anyone decides it should, but because the water has its own schedule, and the water does not consult the people standing on the shore. Before Tess left for Beaufort on Saturday, she carried a canvas tool roll up the stairs to the keeper's quarters and set it on the shelf beside Maren's cot. Inside a socket set a pipe wrench, a voltage tester, and a small handwritten note that read, "Only back in 2 weeks' tea. She did not mention the tool roll to Maren. Maren found it that evening and opened it and read the note and placed it on the shelf beside the green ledger. The tools were, Tess's best said, the ones she used for paying jobs at the Beaufort yard. She would not have left them on an island she did not intend to return to. The last evening came in late September. Maren sat alone on the wide porch on the ocean side of the station. Tess had gone back to Beaufort the day before. Lena had driven back to Raleigh. The island was empty except for Maren and the building, and the ocean and a brown pelican that had been roosting on the boat ramp piling for a week and seemed to consider itself a permanent resident. The sun was low. The light had turned from white to gold to copper, and now it was entering the final transition, the one that happened in the last 10 minutes before sunset on the Outer Banks in September, when the light became so horizontal that it seemed to travel not from the sky to the water, but across the water, skimming the surface, turning every ripple into a small fire. The ocean was changing color, deepening, the daytime blue draining out, replaced by something darker, richer, a blue-black so saturated it looked like the ocean was producing its own pigment from somewhere beneath the surface. Keeper Blue, Cormac's name for it. He had told her about it on a September evening 20 years ago, the two of them sitting on the porch of the cottage, watching the same transition over Pamelico Sound. The old keepers watch for this color, he had said. The men who stood in the towers on the barrier islands for decades, scanning the horizon for ships in distress, watching an ocean that was most nights empty and dark and indifferent. They watched for this particular blue-black because it was the color of the hour when the light died. And the watch truly began the hour when a ship could go down and no one would see it unless someone was awake in the tower looking. Keeper Blue was not a color, it was a responsibility. Maren was seeing it for the third time in her life with full attention. The first on the cottage porch with Cormac. The second alone in the signal room during the storm when the dawn broke gray, and the sea turned this color for a few minutes before the clouds swallowed it. Now, here, on the porch of the station. And it was different this time because she was not seeing it through a window or through rain. She was seeing it from the porch of a building that had been built to watch for it by men whose entire purpose had been to sit in this exact spot and look at this exact color and stay awake. She went inside. She climbed the stairs to the second floor. She climbed the iron ladder, the seventh rung solid now. Tess's stainless bolt holding firm, and pulled herself into the signal room. The windows were clean from the vinegar wash, and the last light came through them in 4 directions, painting the small room in copper. She opened the sea bag. She took out the brass clock. She had been carrying it since the day Cormac died. In the bag on the bench at the harbor, in the rented room above the fish house on the skiff across the sound, through the storm, through the inspection, through the months of labor. It had ticked against her hip and her ribs and the floor of the signal room on the night of the storm and the oak table where she read the letter. It had been measuring the time of her grief, each tick a second she had survived without Cormac, and she had carried it because she was not ready to put it down. She was ready now. She took a screwdriver from the sea bag, Cormac's Phillips head. The handle wound smooth, and she held the clock against the wall of the signal room beside the brass lamp mount on the ceiling joist at eye height, where the keeper would have seen it every time he climbed the ladder to begin his watch. She drove 2 screws through the clock's mounting tabs and into the old stud. The wood accepted the screws with the slight resistance of timber that has been holding things for more than a century and knows how. The clock sat on the wall. The same clock that had sat on the Mavesea's bulkhead for 48 years. The same clock Eamon had chosen and mounted and wound. The face was brass-tarnished green at the edges, the numerals Roman, the hands black. The second hand moved in its small circle, each sweep a breath, each breath a measure of attention. Maren wound it. 3 turns of the key, always 3. Eamon's rule. She felt the mainspring tighten under the key and heard the mechanism respond, the ticking growing louder, steadier. The sound filling the small room, the way a heartbeat fills a chest. The clock was not on a boat anymore. It was not in a bag. It was on a wall in a tower, on a barrier island, doing the thing it had been built to do, keeping time in a place where someone was keeping watch. She opened the green ledger. She had brought it up the ladder in her back pocket, the same way Maeve used to carry it from the kitchen table to the shelf above the stove. She turned to a new page. She sat on the floor of the signal room with her back against the east wall beneath the flag locker. The same locker she had pried open months ago. The same locker Gaskins had sealed his letter behind. And she wrote the first entry of a new account. The date: Life-saving station number 24. Clock mounted in signal room. Wound station active. She closed the ledger. She stood. The signal room was small and square and lit with the last amber light of September. Through the east window, the Atlantic was fully keeper blue, now the color so deep it was almost black. The horizon line barely distinguishable from the sky. Through the west window, Pamlico Sound held the remnants of the sunset in a long copper smear that was fading as she watched. Through the north and south windows, the barrier island stretched in both directions, pale sand and dark grass uninhabited, unlit, the only structure visible in either direction. The station itself, the building she was standing in. The building Howard Gaskins had called the only home he ever really had. No vessels in distress. Sea state 2. Wind northeast 8 knots. Clear. The words were Gaskins. The last words he had written in the logbook on the last day of his service nearly 70 years ago. Maren did not speak them aloud. She did not need to. They were in the room, already carved into the history of the building, the way HRG was carved into the porch column, present without needing to be summoned. She thought about Gaskins, who had stood in this room for 17 years and had called it home and had left it with a letter and a trust, and no one to leave them to accept the future. She thought about the boy on the rubber raft 2 miles offshore from Nag's Head singing about a whale, and the men who had rowed out to get him and the keeper who had written it down. She thought about 341 people who had lived because someone in this tower had been paying attention on the night they needed someone to be paying attention. She thought about what it meant to stand watch, not as a job, not as a shift, not as a duty, but as a promise between a person and a stretch of water, that the person would keep looking even when there was nothing to see, because the one night you stopped looking would be the one night someone needed you to be looking. She thought about Cormac, not the Cormac of the funeral or the recliner or the hidden mortgage, the Cormac of the helm, the wheel, the 4:30 mornings. The Cormac who had placed his hand over hers on the wheel of the Maeve Sea on a September afternoon 47 years ago and corrected her course without a word. He had not been teaching her to steer. He had been teaching her to pay attention. Every tide chart, every weather read, every silent correction of a line coiled wrong. None of it had been about fishing. All of it had been about this, about the willingness to stand at a window in a tower, on a barrier island, and look at an ocean that did not care whether you were looking, and to keep looking anyway. She thought about Eamon winding the clock every Sunday. 23 years, 3 turns, never 4. The winding was not maintenance. The winding was a covenant between a man and a machine that measured the time in which he promised to remain attentive. She thought about Padraig, who had arrived on the Outer Banks with nothing but the knowledge of how to read water and had read it every day for 47 years. She thought about Maeve, who had kept the green ledger for 4 decades, who had taught Maren that a fishing family survived not by catching the most fish, but by knowing precisely what the fish they caught were worth. The ledger was not bookkeeping. The ledger was a watch kept over the family's survival night after night, page after page, in a kitchen on a barrier island by a woman who understood that the numbers were not the point. The point was the sitting down every evening and writing them. She thought about Tess, who was in Beaufort tonight, but who had fixed the 7th rung and showed up at 4:30 and coiled the line flat, and put her hand on her mother's shoulder, and left her best tools on the shelf with a note that said she would be back in 2 weeks. And who was in all the ways that mattered standing watch from 100 miles away. She thought about Lena, who had written a check for $20,000 and placed it on the table and watched Maren enter it in the ledger. and whose single tear on the oak surface had been, in the Calloway language, a paragraph. The clock ticked on the wall. The light faded. The signal room darkened. Maren did not turn on the battery lantern she kept by the hatch. She stood in the growing dark and watched the ocean through the east window as it completed its transition from keeper blue to black, the last color leaving the water, the way the last note leaves a bell, not vanishing, but thinning, spreading, becoming part of the air until you could no longer tell where the sound ended and the silence began. The lantern housing was still missing from the tower. The storm of 1996 had taken it, and no one had replaced it, and the bolt holes in the ceiling joists were still empty. There was no light in this tower for ships to see, but the clock was ticking, and a woman was standing at the window. And somewhere in the dark below the Atlantic was doing what the Atlantic had always done, moving, breathing, carrying whatever it carried, indifferent to the woman in the tower, and to the building on the dune, and to the 115 years of men and women who had stood in this spot and refused to stop looking. The light was not a lamp. The light was not a lantern. The light was not a bulb or a beam or a thing that could be seen from the sea. The light was the standing there. Maren Calloway was 68 years old. She had spent $10 on an abandoned building on a barrier island off the coast of North Carolina. It was the best $10 she had ever spent. Not because of the gold, not because of the letter, but because for the first time since Cormac died, she was doing the thing the Calloways and the Gaskinses and the surfmen and the keepers had been doing on these islands for more than a century. She was not fishing. She was not building. She was not repairing or restoring or surviving. She was awake, and the light was on.